What does it actually take for an entire country to finally say enough? Not a slogan, not a hashtag. An actual armed uprising against the most powerful empire on earth, started by a few hundred poets, teachers, and trade unionists who knew they were going to lose. That's the Easter Rising. And here's the short answer to why it matters more than almost any other week in Irish history. It failed completely as a military operation and succeeded completely as everything else. 6 days of fighting, 16 executions, and within 5 years, an empire that had ruled this island for centuries was gone. More than that, every single thing about how modern Ireland sees itself, what it argues about, even the wording on its postage stamps, traces back to this 1 week. I'm Tig. Look what the Irish went through to get here. This is that story, and honestly, it's got more twists than most films. In today's world, you'd never get this many people to risk everything for an idea. Ireland in 1916 is a country that's been promised freedom, and watched that promise get pushed back again and again for 30 years. Home rule, basically limited self-government, had actually been passed by the British Parliament in 1914. It was law, and then, the day it was meant to take effect, it got suspended because, conveniently, a much bigger war had just started in Europe. There's a real cultural backdrop here, too, that's worth understanding. The years before 1916 weren't just political tension, they were a genuine cultural revival. The Gaelic League trying to save the Irish language. The Gaelic Athletic Association reviving Irish sports. The Abbey Theatre putting Irish stories on stage for the first time in generations. All of that gave a whole generation a stronger sense of being distinctly Irish, and, as it turned out, became fertile recruiting ground for something far more radical. So, a small group inside the Irish Republican Brotherhood look at all this and decide, we are done waiting. 7 men, really, forming what they called the Military Council. Tom Clark, Sean MacDiarmada, Patrick Pearse, Joseph Plunkett, Eamon Seant, Thomas MacDonagh, and James Connolly, who wasn't even in the Brotherhood. He was brought in separately because the council needed his Irish citizen army to make this work. Most of these men are not soldiers. Pearse is a school teacher and a poet. Plunkett and MacDonagh, also poets. Connolly's a Scottish-born trade union organizer who'd spent years fighting for workers' rights, not armies. These are not the men you'd expect to plan a military uprising against the British Empire. And honestly, that's part of why nobody saw it coming. This is the part of the story that sounds made up, but isn't. The plan relied on German weapons. Roger Casement had arranged for a shipment to land on the Kerry coast on Good Friday. The ship, called the Aoud, actually made it. It was sitting off the coast. But the communication failed completely. Nobody from the volunteers showed up to meet it. British naval intelligence had already intercepted German radio messages about the whole operation, and they were watching. The Aoud was captured. Its captain scuttled the ship rather than let the British take the weapons. Casement himself was arrested on a beach in Kerry within hours of landing from a German U-boat. So now the man in charge of the Irish volunteers, Eoin MacNeill, who didn't actually know the maneuvers he'd authorized were cover for an armed rising, finds out the truth. He's furious. He confronts Pierce directly. And on Easter Sunday morning, McNeil does something that should have stopped the whole thing. He puts a countermanding order in the newspaper, the Sunday Independent, telling every volunteer in the country, stand down. No maneuvers today. Imagine being one of the 7 men who'd spent over a year planning this in total secrecy and waking up on the day it's meant to happen to find the cancellation printed in the morning paper. This is the moment that separates these men from almost anyone in modern history. They knew the odds and walked in regardless. The military council meets at Liberty Hall that same morning in something close to panic. And they make the decision that defines everything that follows. They go ahead anyway, just one day later than planned, to try and recover some element of surprise. Which means the rising that does happen is smaller, more confused, and far more isolated than what was actually planned. McNeil's countermand had already gone out to volunteer units across the country. In Cork, 1,200 men mustered and then just dispersed days later after receiving 9 contradictory orders. What should have been a national uprising became almost entirely a Dublin one. In this day and age, nobody signs a document knowing it's basically their own death warrant. These men did, in broad daylight. Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916. Around 1,200 rebels, Irish volunteers, the Irish Citizen Army, 200 women from Cumann na Mban move on key buildings across Dublin. The General Post Office becomes their headquarters. At 12:30, Pierce steps out the front and reads the proclamation of the Irish Republic to a crowd that is, let's be honest, mostly confused. A republic declared on the steps of a post office. The first shots get fired less than an hour later. You won't believe how these 1,200 people held out against 16,000 soldiers. Here's what they were up against. Within 48 hours, the British have poured over 16,000 troops into Dublin, backed by artillery and a gunboat on the River Liffey. 6 days of close, brutal, urban fighting through a city center that was never built for war. The worst of it happens around Mount Street Bridge and North King Street, where the death toll on both sides climbs the highest. One detail that rarely makes it into the story. Among the rebels was a man named Ammon de Valera, commanding a garrison at Boland's Mill. He'd been born in New York, American citizenship. Some historians believe that single fact is part of why, when the executions came, he wasn't one of them. The British government, already under international pressure, may have wanted to avoid executing a U.S. citizen and provoking America further. By the end of the 6 days, 60 civilians dead, hundreds wounded, and Dublin city center on fire. And here's something that surprises a lot of people. When the rebels surrendered on Saturday, ordinary Dubliners weren't cheering them. A lot of them were furious. Their city was wrecked. Some people in the crowds actually jeered the rebels as they were marched away to prison. This was, by any normal measure, a total failure. What happened next inside that prison yard is the most haunting part of this entire story. Between the 3rd and the 12th of May, 16 leaders of the Rising are executed. Most of them shot by firing squad in the Stonebreakers yard at Kilmainham Jail. a place that, up to this point, had basically been closed and forgotten about. Pierce, Clark, and McDonough go first on May 3rd. Over the next 9 days, one by one, the others follow: Plunkett, C. Ant, Mac Diarmada, and more. James Connolly's leg, wound from the fighting, had turned gangrenous. He physically could not stand, so they tied him to a chair in that prison yard and shot him there. He was the last of the 16 to die, May 12th. The night before his own execution, Joseph Plunkett, who was already dying of tuberculosis, was married to his fiancée, Grace Gifford, in the prison chapel. They were given 10 minutes together afterward, 10 minutes, with a guard watching. Then he was taken back to his cell to wait for the morning. Roger Casement, who tried to bring in those German weapons, was hanged separately in London 3 months later, the only one of the leaders executed outside Ireland entirely. The British Prime Minister at the time, Asquith, actually warned that too many executions would make the political situation, quote, impossible for any constitutional party or leader. He was right. And they kept executing people anyway. You won't believe how fast public opinion flipped from jeering them to mourning them in a matter of days. This is the part that actually explains everything. The Rising itself didn't win Irish independence. The executions did. People who jeered at the rebels during the surrender were within days lighting candles for them. Public opinion didn't just shift, it flipped completely. In Ireland, and increasingly in America too, where there was a huge and politically powerful Irish diaspora reading about every single execution in the press. Men who'd been seen as reckless idealists a week earlier were martyrs by the time the last shot was fired in that prison yard. What started as a failure became the single most argued over week in Irish history, and it still shapes everything today. The Easter Rising failed in 6 days and won in 6 years. The 1918 election, where the party associated with the Rising won a landslide. The first Irish Parliament, the War of Independence, all of it traces back to those 16 executions and that prison yard. But here's the part that doesn't get said enough. Ireland still hasn't fully agreed on what 1916 actually means. When the country split over the treaty just a few years later, both sides of that split, the side that supported it and the side that fought a civil war against it, claimed to be the true inheritors of what those 16 men died for. And the ripples don't stop in the 20th century either. The unfinished question of 1916, what an independent, united Ireland was actually supposed to look like, is part of what feeds directly into the Troubles, decades later, in the North. That's the cost. 16 men, a city in ruins, a countermand that nearly stopped the whole thing before it started, and a country that more than 100 years later still argues passionately about what those 6 days actually meant. Which, if you think about it, is its own kind of proof of just how much they mattered. If you want the rest, what happened after the War of Independence, partition, everything that came from this single week, subscribe. There's a lot more they didn't teach you.